guys, Birdie here, and we are doing our October Joy Box. So our Joy Box is a 3-piece art set, Gather in Grace. We've got our large sign, our medium sign, and our chunky leaf here. If you haven't already, go watch the unboxing and supply list to kind of see some different ideas. I talk about different ideas and the supplies that we're going to need for that. So we're going to get started. We are going to break this down into a few different steps. We're going to go with prep. We're going to put a base coat on everything. We're going to do a second coat. Then we're going to do the stenciling. We'll do some distressing, and then we'll assemble everything together. Step one is we're going to prep and tape down all of our pieces. So I'm going to use some masking tape for this. And I always tape down all of my smaller pieces. I'm going to clear out some space here. And when I'm taping down letters, excuse me, that make up a word or a phrase, I try to tape them in the order of which I would read them. That way I make sure that I am taping the right side of the letter. There's a lot of letters in the alphabet that you could, transpose. The H could be viewed the other way, and sometimes the font can be a little misleading. So when you're going to start painting, especially the word gather, in Grace is pretty easy to determine which is the right side, but the A, you could easily flip over and accidentally paint the wrong side. So as you're getting ready to prep and paint the word gather, I would just take a minute and lay them on the scored parts of the board. That way you know what side is the right side. Because if we flip the A around, I can easily see that this thinner side of the A doesn't fit in those score marks. So use that as your guide. Once you've got it laid out, then we can come out over here onto our tape and tape it down. Okay. And then I always just fold my ends over. It just gives me something to grab when I am moving my taped pieces around. And then I'm just going to tape my little leaves, and then that's it for taping. The frames and the bigger leaves I can hold while I paint, but I like to tape all these smaller pieces down. And actually I'm going to spread these out a little bit because I'm going to use different colors for my leaves, and I don't want to have to, I don't want them too close and accidentally paint them the opposite color when I'm doing that. So we're going to get ready and do a first coat or a base coat on everything. I'm going to start with my large piece here, and then we're going to use a large brush to paint our background. Remember, you can use a large flat, you can use a newer chip brush that doesn't look as crusty as mine, or even a black flat for that. And I'm going to dip my brush in some water. Wood is super porous, and I want to make sure that my paint is really fluid to push it around. Now the base coat is going to look kind of splotchy. We want to go light coats. Our goal is to do 1, 2, 3 light coats as opposed to one super heavy coat of paint. You'll get a smoother finish when you do a light coat, and the paint will actually dry faster if you do multiple light coats as opposed to one super heavy coat. The heavy coat might appear to be drying, but they'll be, because it's so thick, your top of that thick coat will dry, but the underneath part takes a little bit longer, and it can start to gum up on you and give you a not smooth finish. You want to just have enough water in your brush so your paint isn't drippy, but just a little bit more fluid. You don't want to have so much water on your brush that you see pools of water or pools of paint on your surface either. Wood and liquid don't really mesh well. And if you have too much paint or too much fluid, too much water on your paint, and you start to see pools of water or pools of paint on your surface, it can cause your wood to warp. It can be too much for that wood to handle. So keep that in mind. You don't want to have too much water. Okay, there we go. So you can kind of see how we're still seeing some of that wood grain coming through. This is a very light coat. Again, it looks kind of splotchy, but that's how we want our base coats to look. Nice, light coats. The next coat that we put on, and the next step, our second coat, will be a lot, it will cover a lot better and look really great and cover that wood grain. Okay, so for the in Grace sign, I'm going to do a white background. And again, I'm going to use my large flat brush for this. And have a little water in my brush. You might want to have, when you're painting with white, it might be better to have a second cup of water that you can use to wet your brush, and then a cup for cleaning your brush. That way you're not getting dirty water in your white paint. Okay, there we go. Now you can see how splotchy that looks. Again, this is that first coat, and it's okay that it's like that. We want to go with light coats. Okay, so I'm going to put that aside. I'm going to grab my leaf here, and I'm going to paint my leaf yellow. Remember, you can paint your pieces whatever colors you love, whatever colors that you're decorating fall with, or if you're, making a gift for somebody, you might want to use the colors that person loves. The colors I'm using are just guides. You do not have to use my exact color scheme. So with my leaf, I want to keep that nice dark edge dark throughout the whole thing. So as I stack my leaves together to give it that nice chunky look, I want my edges to stay consistent. So when you're painting your leaf, you want to start your brush on the inside and pull out. So I'm just working my way all the way around, and that's going to allow me to keep my edges nice and clean. Now, if you accidentally get paint on your edge, you can use a baby wipe to wipe it away. And that'll also show you how to kind of clean up your edges at the end if they're still, maybe we got a little paint on it and didn't see it right away. Okay, so here's that. Again, I can still see some of that wood grain peeking through, but that's okay. Second coat will cover that. Okay. Now I'm going to paint my frames next, and I'm going to paint my frames black. And I'm going to use a makeup wedge for this. I've cut my makeup wedge in half. I'm using it by the thin end. I'm holding it by that thin end, and I want to use this thick end to apply my paint with. We want to have that thicker end. It actually is about the same width of my frame, so I can just run it along this way. Using this skinny end is really hard because it's flexible, so it's hard to push paint, and it's thinner, so you're not going to be able to apply as much paint as you would if you flip it around, use that thick end. It's thicker, so it's more sturdy, and you're able to just kind of pull that paint down the edge of your frame. Okay. You also want to make sure that you don't have globs of paint on. And by globs of paint, I mean you don't want it to look like this. You don't want to have paint that's just super thick on there. So you're going to take your paint palette, and what I do is I will tap it on the actual paint pool, and then I kind of squeegee it off and tap it in another location, and that really gets most of that paint off. Okay, so you don't want to have globs of paint because that makes it super messy. And doing that also allows that makeup wedge to kind of soak in that paint to that end. I'm just going to run my makeup wedge along my edge here, flip it around, and pull it down that end. Okay? Frame pieces are done. I'm going to paint my letters next. In Grace is going to be black, so I can use my same makeup wedge that I was painting my frame with. And when I'm painting my letters, again, we want to just make sure that we don't have huge globs of paint. We want to tap most of that paint off so we only see just a color. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to go straight up and down on top. That way we leave those nice dark edges of the letters as is, and we don't have to worry about trying to paint inside all of these little cracks and crevices and loop-de-loops. So we're going to go up, down, in a light tapping motion. We want to go light coats. Remember, light coats keeps our finish and our edges, our tops, nice and smooth. Okay. So our first coat of the In Grace is done. We still got those nice brown laser edges. Okay. And then for the gather, I'm going to use white. So I'm going to grab another makeup wedge, again holding it by the skinny end, using this fat end to apply the paint with. We're going to tap it into our pool of paint, and then we're going to tap it on a clean area, removing that excess, offloading the excess paint, helping that paint get pushed up into the makeup wedge. And then we're tap, tap, up and down on all the letters. Now black covers really well, and you'll notice that when you're tapping the letters with the black, it's almost like you don't even need a second coat. You might need, just a quick second coat on black, but white is a little less pigmented than black. And so you'll notice that you're going to still see a lot of that wood grain kind of poking through this light coat. It's going to look, again, splotchy and messy looking, but that's okay. Trust the process. Continue with that nice light tapping, that light coat. It's the best way to get a nice, smooth finish. If you accidentally get paint on the edge, you can take a baby wipe and wipe it away before it dries, or a wet rag or a wet towel, paper towel. But there we go. And it's a super white color on the camera, so you can't really see it, but I can see that wood grain kind of poking through, so I know I'll need a second coat on that. Okay, so then we're going to paint our leaves next. Get the base coat on those. And I'm going to use a combination of yellow, orange, and green. We'll start with the green. Now you could use a smaller flat brush to paint your leaves if you wanted to, but I like using kind of the makeup wedge for smaller pieces, so I kind of continue with that, but use whatever is comfortable for you. Okay, so that is our second step. We put a base coat on all of our pieces. Once everything is dry, we are ready for our second coat. Now, before I put my second coat, I do want to talk a little bit about wood. Wood is a super porous material, and when they make plywood, they're pretty much shaving pieces of wood and then gluing them all together. So it's a bunch of thin pieces of wood glued together. And the reason why that's important to know is because when we paint wood like this, sometimes the liquid in our paint and the water and the moisture in our paint can cause the wood to feel rough. And what's happening is the water hits the wood and the baby wood fibers start to expand and they'll start to stand up, causing a rough finish. So after your base coat is dry and you go through and you're, rubbing your wood, and sometimes it's even visually, you can even visually see that the wood fibers are popping up because it might be just like a little area. If you see that happening, use a piece of sandpaper to knock down those fibers. You shouldn't need to sand it so rough that you're taking paint off. It's just a really light sanding to just smooth it back out. So right up in here, and actually kind of this whole piece for me is rough. And it's going to vary from wood to wood. It kind of just depends on how the wood was manufactured and if there's moisture in the air. And there's so many different variables that come into play with how your wood is going to feel after that first coat. So before you go on to the second coat, fill your pieces. And if they need a light sanding, then do that now. So I'm going to just take some sandpaper. This is just from let's see, this is a 400 grit. You could use a 220 or a 300. And I get sheets of it. I cut little squares and fold it in half. And then I just go up and down on here. Okay, everything's been sanded. Now we're ready to put our second coat on everything using the same steps that we used to put our base coat on. Okay, so we've got our second coat on everything, and we're gonna let this dry. If you have a blow dryer on hand, that can help speed up the process so that you can move on to the next step. And at this point, you want to look at all of your pieces and see if your second coat was enough. You might need 3 coats on some pieces, and mostly maybe the white and the yellow. Those are low pigment colors, and so sometimes those need a third coat. So at this point, if you need a third coat after everything dries, go ahead and do that. Just follow the same steps that we used on step 1, putting that base coat on, put that third coat on, and then we will move on to the next step. Okay, so the next step will be to apply our stencil. And before we get started, I want to say that this piece needs to be completely dry for the stencil to work properly. If it feels cool to the touch, like if you touch it and it feels cool, that means it's still damp. So that's a good indication that it's still wet. Use a blow dryer and blast it with some more heat and you'll be good to go. But I mean, it can feel dry to the touch and no paint will come off, but if it feels cool, that means it's still damp and there's still some moisture in that paint. Okay. All right, so let's talk about your stencil. Your stencil is there's 3 layers in your stencil. So I'm going to peel this back here. You've got this top piece that's kind of opaque, and this is the transfer tape. The blue is the stencil, and I can peel that away. And then you've got this white grid paper. That's the backing, okay? So before we get started, I want you to take your old gift card and I want you to rub it on the stencil on this top piece here. We're just making sure that the transfer tape is going to adhere well. Because the transfer tape is a really non-tacky, non-sticky tape that just helps us pull the stencil off the backing and get it put down on our piece. And so sometimes that can kind of peel away. So take your card and just rub it over your stencil, called burnishing, I guess. Okay. Then we're going to flip it over so we see the grid here. And we're going to peel slowly at an angle. Don't go straight up. Come back at an angle. We're going to peel away the backing. So now we have the transfer and the stencil. And as we're peeling, we just want to go slow. And if when you start peeling, you see the blue still sticking here, I want you to push it back and just rub it in that area. This is extremely important in the areas where we have those little squares that are part of that plaid pattern. So as I'm coming to this area where those squares are, if the squares are still attached to your backing, lay it down, rub it, and then go again. And they should stick. Okay, so we're just going to go slow, peel at an angle, and keep an eye out for your squares. Okay. So here's a case where my corner is still stuck. You can kind of see it's not staying down. So I'm going to pull that, push that back, rub it in that area, give it a good rub, and go again. And sometimes you've just got to guide that little guy down. Let's try it again. It still kind of wants to stick. We're going to go. There we go. Okay. So now you can throw the grid paper away. Okay. All right. Now your stencil square is as big as your board. So we're going to use the edge of the board to line up the stencil. Okay, and mine Let's see, here we go. I'm going to start by just lining up the bottom where I can see it, and then kind of the edge, and everything else should fall into place. There we go. And once you've got your edge lined up and this lined up, then I'm going to take my hand and just smooth it down with my hand to start with to make sure that it's not wrinkly up here, and we get a nice smooth contact without any wrinkles or bubbles, okay? You do have a little bit of flexibility before it gets totally adhered to your board to kind of lift it up and adjust it, but not a lot. So make sure that you have one edge lined up before you start smoothing it down. So I kind of held up this piece, lined it up here, and then pushed it down, okay? Then we're going to take our gift card, which I set in my paint because that's typical how I work. Messy crafter. Okay, we're going to take our gift card and we're going to rub it onto the stencil. What we're doing is we're helping that sticky blue part of the stencil adhere to our wood. Again, paying attention to where these little squares are that are part of our stencil, this inner piece right here, we really want to make sure that those are adhered well, okay? All right, and then we're going to do just what we did with the background. We're going to remove this transfer tape away from the stencil. The blue needs to stay, okay? The stencil is blue, our background, whatever color background is you're using, you know, you'll get kind of a funky color. I'm using white, so it just looks blue. Okay. We're just pulling slowly. Do not pull straight up. It tends to pull the stencil away from your board. So we just want to pull at a nice, slow angle away. And like before, if any of the stencil stays stuck here, lay it back down, give it another good rub, and then start again. Okay. And then that piece can be garbage. So now we're left with this. This is our stencil pattern. Okay. So I'm using the khaki brown, a light brown for my stencil. Remember, you can use any color that you want. And I'm going to use a makeup wedge for this step. Now, I created kind of a multi-colored pattern where I have, let's see if I bring it up a little closer. So I have the light brown here. The bigger stripes are a little bit darker. And all I did was use I used one coat, one light coat on everything, and then I came back where I wanted it to be darker and did a second coat, okay? So we're gonna start with our first coat. Using a makeup wedge, we want to make sure to have just a small amount of paint on that makeup wedge. Using it the same way, the thick end here, skinny end, hold it by the skinny end, and we're just doing a tap, tap. When you're working with this stencil, you want to make sure to do up and down taps. We don't want to brush. We don't want to move our makeup wedge or a brush from side to side because bleeding will happen and paint will get under our stencil. So up, down, up, down. We also want to make sure to use light coats so we eliminate the possibility of the bleed happening. If you've ever worked with stencils before, you might be aware or know of that term. Bleeding just means that the paint has gone under your stencil and you get these little blobs instead of a nice crisp line. It kind of just makes your lines look wavy. There's little bits of paint that, you know, are outside of that line. Okay, so I'm going through and I'm going to just stencil the entire, I'm going to go paint over the entire thing with a nice light coat. Up, down, no brushing. We want to eliminate any bleeding. Okay, so once we've got our base coat down, again, nice light coat so you can kind of see how splotchy that is. We're going to let that dry. And now I'm going to go in after it's dried with a second coat on the areas that I want to be darker. So I'm okay. I want these stripes, the thin stripes, to be nice and light. And I want to see some of that white. I'm kind of going for a fabric type plaid pattern where it's a little bit rustic and distressed looking. So where these lighter lines look splotchy and uneven, I'm okay with that. Now, if you want a solid pattern, by all means, go through and put a second coat on everything. Just be aware that if you want darker lines, you might have to go with a darker color paint and kind of mix it up a little bit. You could do, you know, all these lines light and then come in with maybe a little bit of a darker brown and get a nice solid color there by adding multiple layers of paint. Because I'm okay with it being splotchy and worn looking, I don't need to put a second coat on my thin lines, okay? So I'm going to go through and put a second coat just on those thick lines. So I'm focusing on this line going straight down, this line here, and then this horizontal line. And everything else I'm going to leave as is. So that's where these makeup wedges come in great. They're about the width of my line. So I can easily just come right down this line and tap in that area. I got a little bit of some gunk here, so I'm going to clean that up. And as you're working, if you are using different colors in your pattern, which would be super fun and amazing, and you're worried about, you know, painting in these lines and running into the other lines, you can cut your makeup wedges to fit in those spaces a little bit more, you know, trim it off, do what you need to kind of get it to fit inside those areas so you get a clean stencil or line, especially if you're doing multiple colors. Okay. So you can kind of see how that second coat made those lines darker, and then I have a light brown on all the other stripes that I have. Okay, so we're going to let this dry. I don't recommend using a blow dryer on this step. You might be tempted to try and blow dry all of your stencil, but what will happen is you'll melt the stencil. This is kind of not heat resistant, I should say. It is not heat resistant. And what happens is the sticky part on the back will kind of melt and cause gunking to happen on your board. So no blow dryer on this step. Okay. All right. So mine's pretty much dry because I did nice light coats. So what we're going to do next is pull back this stencil. And again, using that same technique where we're pulling from an end or a corner and coming at an angle, we do not want to go straight up. We want to just slowly peel back your stencil. Okay. And this is probably the most satisfying part of working with stencils, is peeling this back and revealing this beautiful pattern that we've got. And your stencil, because it's got paint on it, does start to degrade. So you might have some breakage. That's okay. Don't worry about that. I'm going to just leave that there, and I'm going to grab and start just pulling my big pieces. If it breaks, I'll come back to those. Okay, so it kind of broke apart. That's okay. Now I'm going to turn it around just for the ease of showing you here. And I'm going to go from the other corner to get the rest of this. Well, I'll go from this corner over. Once this is already pulled up. Okay. All right. Now we can come back and pull any pieces that broke off, pull those away. And now we're left with these inner pieces. We've got the squares here, the little rectangles here, and these long rectangles here. And in the supply video, I recommend having either a box or a X-Acto knife, some sort of pointy needle bit, or if you have worked with stencils before, you might have something like this that is kind of typical with silhouettes and cameo tools. So you might have something like that. And if you don't have any of these, a sewing needle or a push pin works great as well. Okay, so I'm going to use my poker tool, this piercing tool. I picked this up at the Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to slide it under one of the corners of this little square, kind of lift up that corner, and I can get my fingernail under it and lift up. And now I have revealed, let me get a little closer here. So now I have that little square there that is revealed. Okay, so just a little poke underneath the corner of one of those, and that allows you to lift it up. You just want to be careful that you don't scratch your surface too much. But honestly, these pieces within your little leaf here are going to get covered up anyways. So if you do, that's okay. You can always come back and touch it up with a little liner brush if you get too much of a scratch happening. There we go. All right, so we've got the stencil off. That is the stencil step. And let me bring it up. You can see my light lines compared to my dark lines where I had that 2 coats on it. And it looks great. Okay, so the next step then is distressing. Now this is an optional step. So if you want to have nice, solid, clean lines, you can skip this step. This step is all about making it look worn and old and kind of dirty, rustic, farmhouse, however you want to call that. But we're going to do some distressing. So I'm going to grab my sandpaper, and I'm going to start with my bases, and I'm just going to start sanding. Now remember that your stem or your frame is going to sit here. So if you want to see any distressing inside, kind of maybe hold this here so you kind of have an idea of where you might want some distressing happening. So I'm going to just start up in the corners and kind of try and remove some of the paint. I'm going to remove some of the paint kind of around the letters and down in the corner here. When you're distressing, a harder grit sandpaper kind of works easier to remove paint quicker. And then once I'm done distressing, I'm just going to take a baby wipe and remove the dust away and kind of see where I'm at. Sometimes that dust gets in the way and I can't see if I've distressed enough. But I've got some wood kind of showing here, up in here, and down in here. I might do a little bit more. There we go. So we'll do a little cleanup now. And you can do more distressing after you've assembled your pieces. You know, if you see that you want to have a little more worn look, then you can come back and do that as well. If you're unsure about distressing but want to give it a try, start small, start with small little areas, and then come back and add as you go. Kind of helps to see it put together too sometimes when you're distressing. Okay, so I'm going to take this piece next and do a little sanding. Just soften up my stencil area. So you kind of see I really even softened up my lighter lines even a little bit more. Okay. And I'm going to take my leaf, and I just want to reveal some of the wood edges around here. So I'm kind of focusing the sanding on just those edges. Okay, we'll clean this up. Next, I'm going to do my frame pieces, and I really took my sandpaper to these. If you can see, I see a lot of the edging around all of my frame pieces. I really love the look of that on my frame. All right, I'm not going to distress my little leaves, and I'm not going to distress my letters, but you can if you want to. So that is the distressing phase. I'm going to kind of clean up all my dust, and then we will start putting this together. All right, let's get this all assembled. We are on the last phase of this project, the last step, I should say, where we glue everything together. So I'm going to start with my large sign here. And I'm going to put my frame on first. So what you want to do is make sure that you've got all the right pieces. So I'm going to lay them out. Make sure. Okay, there we go. So those are my frame pieces. These ones all go to the small frame. Let's get this out of the way so we can get this full thing in here. This one's a little bit longer. I forget how long it is. All right, so I'm going to use some wood glue. You can use super glue. You can use anything that's a clear drying glue. And I'm just going to put a small bead or line along my frame. okay? And then I'm going to lay it on this edge. Now, before I get too crazy on where it's at, I'm going to move to this next step. So kind of want to have an idea on putting this together. There we go. You want to start with this one because this one goes from end to end. So we can get that one down and then we can work our way around. Okay, and you want to use something heavy. Clips can help hold your pieces, especially if the wood feels a little warped or rounded, which sometimes can happen with plywood when we cut thin strips like this. It kind of wants to just do its own thing. And if that's the case, then just use a clamp and it will clamp down fine. Okay, so then I'm gonna glue my letters. And when you're gluing your letters, if you're using super glue, you really just need a dot here and there. Because I'm using wood glue, I'm gonna put 3 dots on here, and then I'm gonna use my fingers and kind of just tap that glue around, spreading it to the entire thing. This also helps remove any excess. You don't want to have too much paint that's going to be squirting out, although that's the point of using a clear drying glue, just in case it does squirt out or it shifts a little bit. You're not going to see that once that dries. So I'm going to use my score marks to help line that up, and we'll just continue working down. Okay, that's it for this sign. It is done. You're good to go. At this point, once it's dried and the glue's all cured, if you want to do more distressing, you certainly can. If you felt like you wanted to add just a little more distressing to it, that is an optional step. But this one is done. Let's get our small sign put together. I'll put this one aside. I'm going to start by laying out my frame pieces. Your top and bottom frame pieces go all the way to the ends, and then your side pieces sit inside those. So I'm going to start with this bottom one, and again, put a line of glue down the frame. Now, my frame piece kind of has a little bit of a warp to it. Again, that just is something that happens with plywood when we cut it. So I'm going to grab some clamps to help hold it. I'm going to get it where I want it, and then I'm going to put a clamp on it. Now, if you don't have these clamps, you've got big ones or small ones you can get at the dollar store. But if you don't have those, bag clips work just as well. Okay. Then I'm going to put some clamps at the top here because my piece at the top is a little wonky as well. Get that clamp down and all will be good once that glue cures. And there we go. Okay. So now that my frame's on, I can work on this inside piece even while I have my clamps on. So I'm going to start with my letters. When you're pulling delicate letters off the tape like this, I try and hold my pieces upside down and gently pull the tape away from them. So I'm going to put a couple drops of glue on and then tap that glue around to spread it around. If you're using super glue, you do not want to tap the glue around. Just put those drops and you're good to go. Super glue is super strong, so you don't need to have super glue on all the entire surface. And there we go. I'm going to leave the clamps on this while my glue cures, but that one is done. So now we can move on to the leaves. Now with the leaves, I am creating this nice chunky leaf that can stand by itself. But as I mentioned in the supply video, you can paint all three of your pieces and have them kind of placed wherever you want on your shelf as separate pieces. They'd have to lean against something, right? They could be tied to the front of a candle, or you can add a string on the stem and have a 3-piece banner. So there's some options there, but so I'm going to glue mine all together. I'm going to put a fair amount of glue on my bottom piece. And to help the glue spread around, I kind of just do this. I kind of move my pieces around together and then I squeeze. And that just kind of helps spread that glue inside those two. I did have some glue coming out the edge. So I'm going to grab a baby wipe real quick and wipe away the excess. Okay. And we'll line it up, and there we go. Then we're going to put another layer on. And then we'll start with our top. Now, if you wanted to use this on a tabletop where you might see both sides of the leaf, you could paint that back piece as well. And then it's dual-sided. You could do a different color on the other side. And by the other side, I mean this back side. So if this was setting up on a tabletop for a centerpiece or something, and you would see the back and the front, you could paint that as well. I'm just kind of using my fingers and making sure all my points are lined up nice and well. So it kind of looks like one big chunky piece. And there we go. Give it a little squeeze. You can use a clamp here to help hold it if you need to. You can put something heavy on it. There we are. There's our leaf. And that is it, guys. That is our assembly of our 3-piece sign. We've got Gather in Grace with our little leaf. Okay. I can't take these off quite yet. My glue hasn't cured. But that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this month's video, or this month's craft, excuse me. And I hope you're finding time to craft. I hope you're finding time to do something enjoyable for yourself. You're deserving of that, so don't let anyone or yourself tell you different. Get in your craft room, sit at your kitchen table, wherever you can, and get some paint on that brush and start crafting. I hope you guys have a great October, and I look forward to crafting with you in November. Bye, guys.